Good afternoon, everybody. So I introduced myself earlier, but I'm Michelle Grant, current president of Csoc. By way of further introduction, I trained overseas. I went to the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. I moved to New Zealand in 2007. I'm currently a dual citizen, though. I did get my Kiwi citizenship. There's been a bit of Australian slagging going on. I run a small consultancy in the Wairarapa. I'm a member of the Engineering New Zealand special interest group called General Practitioners. I've been a member of the group since not long after it was founded, but I don't consider myself a general practitioner. I consider myself a specialist. I'm a structural engineer. But regardless of the label that we're calling ourselves, I think that this group forms the backbone of the engineering community in New Zealand. We do the bulk of engineering for our regional communities. And while big developments for new base isolated buildings are needed within the city centres, we are the ones that are helping design someone's new home, helping someone build or strengthen their single retirement asset commercial property. We are closer to our clients, and we get more of an opportunity to develop personal relationships with the people and the community that we're doing our work for. There's a lot happening and changing in our industry currently, and while we are undergoing this change, I've started to question the idea that we can be a generalist and keep on top of all of the new developments and current learnings across multiple disciplines. Structural alone is developing and changing at such a rapid pace. The change is not within the fundamental design principles, they stay steady, but the change is new products, new assessment methodologies, new research, amendments of standards that keeps happening on an almost constant basis. I quite often find myself reading about changes to the industry after kids have gone to bed, just trying to keep up. And this is without adding an additional specialty on top, such as geotech. The challenge of occupational regulation will only add further complication to this concept. We, as you've probably heard, based on the MB consultation document, MB have said that occupational regulation's coming up and structural's in the firing line. Structural, geotech and fire engineering are likely to be the first off the rank. For structural, we're a bit ahead of the game there. We already have our body of knowledge and skills, which Gordon, I think, put a lot of work into preparing. And while there's still a lot of unknowns about how occupational regulation, how this licensing is going to be implemented, it's likely that to be a licensed structural engineer, we're going to need to demonstrate an understanding of the relevant body of knowledge and skills. And this presents a unique challenge for structural engineering. I have a different skill set from someone designing multi-storey base isolated structures. There are aspects of the body of knowledge and skills that I don't use on a day-to-day basis in the work that we do in regional Wairarapa. For example, we don't do strut and tie analysis every day, and I know this is something that I'm probably going to need to study in some areas amongst some others if licensing comes along. The system has to accommodate this. I think this is possible. Despite the different applications, we all have the same fundamental base knowledge, and this is reflected in the body of knowledge and skills. But I have to say I'll also be strongly advocating for some training, that training is needed. We all need to be given the opportunity to plug any holes in our knowledge. Training that has to be prepared for practitioners, available for practitioners who are working, and presented in a way that encourages people to discuss and learn any and all new concepts that they will need. And it's a great chance for us to bring together theory we may have learned at university, however long ago that may have been for some of me, the experience we've gained to date, and just to make sure that the skills in the practical application of designing in an earthquake-prone country are staying up where they need to be. I really welcome the chance for us all to talk more today, and I think it's just so great that we have this forum. While I like to hear about the more unique projects like the Majestic Centre strengthening, what I really want to know is, how did you hold on to the brick wall on the last strengthening project you did, or how did you design that pin base footing for a residential steel frame, and can we talk about that? Let's talk more about the everyday, the run-of-the-mill engineering that keeps our communities safe at home and at work. There's so many different ways to do the same thing, and it's really interesting, I think, to find out how other people approach the same problem, because it's this type of engineering, our engineering, that keeps a lot of our communities ticking. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And can I introduce Pete van Grinsven? Pete's an experienced engineer. He is the current chair of the Engineering General Practitioners. He's been everything from a labourer to a chippy to a drafty to an engineer, and was one of the was instrumental in founding the EGP.
Thank you, Martin. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for being here. I hope this session will be useful and give you some deeper insight into what we mean by engineering. Before I begin though, I'm going off topic for a couple of minutes. The afternoon of 15th March 2019 made me stop and think. I was driving to a site, listening to national radio, when I heard the words shooting and mosque. My heart sank. My associate's a young Muslim man married with 3 children. Being a Friday afternoon, he was at mosque. Eventually, I heard Christchurch. It was relief, followed quickly by a whole raft of emotions. 2 weeks later, I stood outside the El Nur Mosque on a Friday evening, overwhelmed by the reality. The Prime Minister's call of "They are us" struck a chord. My young associate has the same dreams and aspirations as all of us. He wants to live a good life, where he, his wife and children can walk through their lives without being made to feel different. One thing I forget to do is to really see the humanity in all of us. I decided that had to change. And I promised myself that if ever given the opportunity to speak in a public forum, I would do something to foster that change. This is that something. To paraphrase, tyranny lives where good people do nothing. I'd like us all to stop doing nothing. Please, saying nothing, turn to those near you and take a moment to look at each other. In that silence, just take a moment to recognise each other's humanity. Ngā mihi, thank you. Let's take a breath and move on. General practice engineers. Why be a general practitioner? To answer the question, I want to take you on a journey. We'll start with a description of where the engineer came from, what the engineer does, and specifically what it means to be a general practice engineer. You have to answer the question for yourself. I would like to believe that my thoughts will persuade you that being a GP engineer brings great rewards and satisfaction. The question is really addressed to groups. Young engineers inquiring what they want to do in their engineering career, or more seasoned engineers thinking about the engineering that they already do and seeking recognition and a place where they can share their experience with others. First, we need to answer the question, engineers, who are they and what do they do? There has always been a need for people who understand how things work. These people have always been useful to the societies they live in, not only understood how things worked, but also figured out how to construct them. Helps to have the glasses on. And how to make them more useful. What things, you may ask? And I would answer pretty much everything that is used by our communities to enable our way of life. This has been true since time immemorial, since the first stick was used to do something other than to be a stick. Pretty soon, someone wanted to make a better stick to do the job they wanted to do. Unfortunately, making the better stick required tools. In themselves, a better way of manipulating resources to make manipulating resources easier. It's not hard to see where engineers came from. I have no idea when the word engineer was coined, but versions of the word and concept have been around for as long as records have been kept. I would contest that the early engineer, whether he was called engineer or not, was always a generalist. Early societies passed their skills from master to apprentice, who became the master after a few thousand hours of training. Once the apprentice was able to teach the master, they had graduated. Formalizing engineering. First formalised engineer was a military engineer, used by a leader to support armies of fighters in the field who could make no progress without these specialties. Their skills were transferable, and they were soon engaged in other works when their leaders decided there was no fighting to do, and the civil engineer was born. As time went on, the art became a craft, became a specialty that split into more specialties and then more, till today, engineering is made of hundreds of specialties. The strange thing is that for the engineer to be successful, the art part remains. Without imagination and the ability to see the unseen, an engineer cannot function. The art of design must be rooted in a thorough knowledge and understanding of how things work. General practice engineer must be conversant with all the fields that relate to the work they are doing, or essentials will be missed on the project and the project will fail. The art of design, that is the work of a GP engineer, is born in the learning and experience they have. How is this applicable to you and your own engineering aspirations? To answer our question, we need to ask ourselves what we want to achieve. Do we want to be part of a large design machine that brings forth magnificent structures and projects? Or do we want to be the masters of our own destiny to see our undoubtedly smaller projects through from start to finish? Being the engineer who does it all means starting with a rough sketch, assessing what may affect the design's success or failure, questioning ourselves to see that we have not missed a critical element that will affect the outcome, and having seen through the gathering of information, consulting with experts as needed, geotechs, considering a way that success may be achieved, looking at options and weighing them against others, deciding which will do the job best. We then need to convince others, developers, owners, architects, TAs, that we've got it right. Having done all that, we then need to communicate how the outcome is to be achieved according to our design. For an EGP, it does not end there. We must then follow through and see that those constructing what we have designed actually do what we've asked them to do. That may even involve talking through construction processes with the people who actually build what we have designed. We must then be able to communicate that our design objectives have been met in a manner that satisfies the stakeholders mentioned above. Going back to the question, why be an engineering general practitioner? As a young engineer choosing a career path, you may see yourself as an engineer involved in grand projects. Then being an NGP is probably not for you. But if you want to be the master of a whole project, then you'll probably have to be an EGP. This career path is not for everyone. Your name will never be associated with the CRL or the Harbour Bridge or the Sky Tower. But you will move around your community with a great deal of satisfaction. As everywhere you go, there will be examples of projects that you have seen through from start to finish, and they're all yours. They stand and serve because you did a good job, just you. You can see I'm passionate about this. If you're a seasoned engineer and you relate to everything I've described, then you're already an EGP. Oh, missed a bit. EGP SIG was hatched by a group of general practice engineers who have met every month for the last 10 years in Rodney, north of Auckland. They shared their experiences and knowledge and came to realise that there was power in having a collective voice, power in sharing the work that they lived and breathed in their daily practice, power in supporting each other, power in using their collective knowledge and experience to establish the best practice methodologies. I invite you to look a little deeper at what we are doing. We are on the ENZ website. We have one of our own. We run a Slack channel. We are sponsoring webinars on topics of interest. We're working with ENZ to create resources of interest or of use to general practice engineers, and we advocate for our members in the fast-changing regulatory world that we live in. I hope the rest of this session will be of use and will prompt you to join us. Every additional member increases the strength of our voice. Ngā mihi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Pete. There have been a couple of program changes due to fog in Hamilton this morning. And Stacey Campbell from Engineering New Zealand unfortunately can't make it, but I was very lucky to persuade Craig Lewis, who's the chair of CEAS and an award-winning engineer in his own right, to step up and make a presentation in her place about dealing with complaints and insurance.
Thank you, Martin. He's pretty compulsive. My arm's still aching from twisting it up. my back at about 10:30 this morning. But Peter, that was a lovely reflection on March 2019. We have two Muslim staff members in our office in Christchurch, one draftsman, one engineer, and it was only where it unfolded was only 2 or 3 k's from our office, and I'll never forget my mixture of emotions from that afternoon of anger and sadness and guilt that those guys and their family and communities, should have been safe in our city. So it's nice that you took time to reflect on that, and lovely how passionate you are about our industry, because large or small, I think it's a wonderful industry and something we all should be proud of, regardless of what we do. This was put together really, really quickly this morning between plenums, but I think a number of bullet points I just wanted to talk to quickly, I think relate to what we all do. It doesn't matter how big firm is, what we do. I think dealing with the easiest way of dealing with difficult clients is don't let them become difficult clients. Look after them, communicate well with them. If we get some fundamentals right, then we can avoid complaints or nip them in the bud. The nature of what we do, the increasing pressure on the construction industry on budgets and consent timeframes and build times, and now the supply chain, is just making what we all do sort of more challenging as time goes on. But I think if we do just stop to focus on a few key things and the rollout of any project, we can make our life a lot more enjoyable and hopefully avoid those complaints processes. So I think it starts with really clearly defining our scope of work, and perhaps for the engineering general practitioners, that's even more important. If you are, sort of in a, for want of a better term, a jack of all trades on a project, maybe in smaller centres where you might be the only professional involved on a project, being asked to do, a range of tasks, I think it's really even more important to define your scope of work. Agree that with your client, and likewise if there's any grey areas, also list the stuff that you're not doing that is the responsibility of other parties. Embody that scope of work in a signed contract, and just can't stress enough, where at all possible, stick with the industry standards, CCCS and the short form agreement. Resist bespoke conditions like the plague. There's too many fishhooks in it. Something might seem okay, but they're not. And I think the biggest problem with the industry is the amount of time that's being spent working through bespoke conditions, but also the fishhooks in those, and the way that it does jeopardise our insurance cover. So hopefully the vast majority of general practitioners, do get away with just short form agreements. Even short form agreements, I think you've got to be careful that you don't become a bit blasé, like that looks like the short form agreement that I signed up with a particular client, for the last couple of years. There's a couple of large institutions, including Christchurch International Airport, who have doctored up their own version of the short form agreement, which on first appearances looks like just a slightly different branding on the industry short form, but with a slight change of words and removal of a couple of key clauses. For example, the limitation clause, clause 8 on the back of that. So, I think it's really important, even if it appears like an exact copy of an industry short form, be very careful with what's being put in front of you. With those industry short forms, we all need good insurance cover. Insurance isn't a grudge purchase. I think for professionals such as engineers, you need to foster the relationship with your insurance provider like you would your lawyer or your accountant. It's not like buying insurance cover for a car or your home contents. I think you really want your insurer to stand behind you when something untoward happens, or if you get into a tricky situation. So foster that throughout your professional careers, and it's well worth getting good cover. I think it's tempting for smaller practitioners and maybe practitioners who are starting out to just go with the absolute minimum of PI cover, maybe $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 cover. At the lower ends of covers, it doesn't take much it's not much of an increase in premium to go from $500,000 to $1 million a cover, say. Just far more peace of mind. I'd strongly suggest you consider slightly higher elected excesses to offset the premium increase. Back your QA processes and your internal processes, and it's probably something worth doing, is just looking at higher levels of excess to get a higher level of cover. Always limit your liability with any contract you're signing into, and as I just said, that trap of signing up to something that's had the limitation clause removed, be really, really careful. The recent, the February 2019 version of the short form agreement changed the lower and upper bounds of PI cover to 5 times the fee with a minimum of $100,000 and a maximum of $500,000. That was changed for very good reason. There was pressure from different parts of the industry. The 5 times the fee was seen as far too low. We didn't want to be seen as men and women of straw, so that's why the $100,000 lower bound came in. So, the amount of PI cover you put up and limit your liability to has got to be fair to all parties. There's some case law out of the UK where the whole of a contract has been thrown out by the courts because of a ridiculously low limitation of liability, just seen as manifestly unfair to the client body. So it's got to be fair to both sides. It's a contract. Clear communications and record keeping are vital. I think the title of this talk originally talked about trends and complaints that Stacey Campbell was going to talk to. One of the clear trends, I think, in the complaints and the disciplinary actions that Engineering New Zealand gets is, I think, a high proportion of those complaints comes about through poor communication or communication breaking down with a client. I think engineers are great at solving problems. We don't usually like animosity or negativity, and too many engineers, when something happens that they don't feel comfortable dealing with, will sort of go quiet or bury their head in the sand. I think it's important to deal with issues as they arise, communicate well with your client. Emails are a pretty horrible means of communication often. There's nothing like a face-to-face meeting to head issues off before they amount, or a phone call. You can hear the tone in your client's voice, detect if there's an issue and deal with it straight away and nip it in the bud, rather than getting into a more aggressive email to and fro. Record keeping is vital. Our lawyers that assist Engineering New Zealand and CEAS through claims just stress this time and time again. If heaven forbid something goes all the way to court to deal with an insurance claim, file notes, good reports, site reports are worth their weight in gold. A judge will always place more credence on someone's verbal recollection, often many years down the track, versus a simple file note. It can be the most ropey bit of paper note or a diary note, from the time, but worth its weight in gold. So clear record keeping is vital. As is QA, everything we do, calcs or model checks, certainly final drawing checks, reports. I think part of the initiative of the Engineers General Practitioners group is having a buddy system for those sort of sole practitioners so that you can run stuff past each other. Having a buddy system if you don't have other people within your firm to run stuff past. It's no sign of weakness if you're not sure about something. All of us, I think if you've been reading something or staring at a certain problem long enough, you do start to second guess yourself, or we had started looking at a problem, so a fresh set of eyes is worth its weight in gold as well. Insist on complete commissions. I think we're fortunate as engineers, there's no excuse not to see the construction monitoring phase through. It's a prerequisite of the material standards that we monitor the work included on our PS1, as opposed to our architectural colleagues who might get bullied into just providing a set of documents and I don't want you to administer or monitor the work. We should see that through because that's a key part of any project to pick up changes and issues that maybe escape the documentation check. PS4 sign-offs is something that our insurers are quite hot on at the moment. There's been, Martin recently wrote an article in Engineering NZ magazine. Too many projects are being signed off based on a few sketchy photos provided by a contractor or contractor's PS3. I think you really need to be thorough in the level of monitoring that is required for each and every commission. If you're getting work monitored by colleagues on your behalf, I think you've got to satisfy yourself with the competence of those colleagues, and we're responsible for our younger staff as they look after work for us. This is a favourite of mine. Invoice, once your PS4s are issued, send out your final invoice, get the payment in the door early. We're lucky that we're usually involved up front in projects. We can get our job done in and out, paid before the kitty runs dry. Leave that for the architects and the joiners and the painters to scrap over. But it's amazing how many complaints and negative outcomes occur because the money runs out on projects. In the event that a complaint is made or you do get into a difficult situation with a client, engage with them, but don't admit liability. Even if you think within your heart that you have mucked up or done something wrong, never admit liability because that compromises your insurer's ability to defend you. So there's a big difference between engaging with your client and trying to work through an issue, but don't admit liability. If any issues do arise, raise them as early as possible with your insurer because they'll be able to wrap around the necessary legal advice and expert assistance to help you through an issue, if there is an issue. Often with spurious claims, good legal advice from your insurer will head stuff off before it festers further and becomes an issue. And just finishing up, so trends, didn't get a chance to talk to Stacey, but I think over the last few years, and I was on the CAS Claims Committee for about 5 years before the Canterbury earthquakes, there was a real trend through engineers getting sort of embroiled in leaky building issues. We're seen as an easy target. We've got deep pockets, usually got good insurance cover, so we'd get roped into weathertight homes resolution problems or leaky commercial buildings just because we were involved on a project. Touch wood, most of those seem to have run their course now. The poor communication, I think, is the key trend. At the moment, it's really just stuff festering, clients not thinking that their professionals, the engineers or other professionals are listening to them, festering and stuff just growing out of all proportion. And also unreasonable client expectations from the front. I think that's where defining your scope at the outset is so vital, so that everyone's on the same page. The client doesn't think he's getting something more than you've interpreted his instructions as. So yeah, hopefully everyone's got a bit out of that. 17 seconds to go. Any questions? It's good, that clock.
It's good, isn't it? Stephen.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. It's a great summary. Just on the short form conditions in relation to the small practitioner, we're dealing with homeowners, and so can you elaborate what the differences are in the ability to limit our liability and where that is on the short form?
You can't. So the last, the February 2019 version, the same short form is now used for commercial and private clients. At the end of the day, the Consumer Guarantees Act means that you can't limit your liability for a private individual, or even if you're contracted to an architect or a project manager who in turn is providing a service to a private individual, you can't limit it under that, but under contract or tort. But depending on the relationship, because we saw this in Christchurch through the earthquakes, where you might be several steps removed from the homeowner. You might be engaged by an architect who's engaged by a project manager who's engaged maybe from one of the the main insurer providers who ultimately is building a new house or repairing a house for a private individual. I think if push ever comes to shove, because you're removed from having those face-to-face discussions with the private individual, and you have less and less opportunity to gather an appreciation for what their expectations are, the courts would act in the favour, and I think the limitation would have some benefit in that situation. But that there is no way of limiting your liability if you're engaged directly by a homeowner, only if you've got a commercial arrangement on another project.
One more.
Thanks. Do you see any conflict? The idea about admitting liability, is there any conflict there ethically with acting in good faith and committing to make good on errors?
It's not about not ultimately fronting up and correcting whatever the act, error, act or omission was. It's not admitting liability before your insurer gets a chance to come in and rectify the situation. That's what your insurance policy is for. And you might think that you're, in the heat of the moment, you might think that you're liable, but it's whether there's any contributory contribution to whatever the problem is by other parties. Maybe the architect has had a small part to play in it, maybe the geotech has had a small part to play in it, maybe a planner. You shouldn't do that because it might not be all your fault. You might think it is. Often it might be a straight calculation error, but it's not about trying to hide from your responsibilities. It's really just giving your insurer, you don't want to compromise the conditions of your insurance policy to get in and rectify the situation. So yeah, it's just a matter of letting it take its course. And I think the insurers, as soon as an issue, the insurance lawyers will say as soon as an issue happens, it stops being about engineering as much as we're passionate about what we do, and we want to find a solution and just fix the problem. It becomes a commercial exercise. So you just really got to let it take its course for the situation to sort of deflate and then work through what the solution is to that in a measured manner. And if you're sort of challenged on site, it's not the right environment to come up with something necessarily in a level-headed manner.
Thank you, Craig. I'm going to cut it there. So we're now 4 minutes into Gordon's presentation. I appreciate your time. Thank you. So the next, so you may be asking why I'm doing all the talking. Ian told me that he's the good-looking one, and so I'll do the talking. So there we are. We all know our roles. So the next one, unfortunately, Helen couldn't make it either. She was on the same flight with Stacey. Small office practice. Gordon Hughes has very kindly offered to take over in the place there. Now, I think that Craig has probably covered a reasonable amount of small office practice, and so, Gordon, you've only got 10 minutes now. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thanks. Me again. Kelly's going to come along and help me. I'm taking the view of a practitioner who's been around for an awful long time, and some of the things I might have learned or that I think are important. Kelly's just gone out on her own in the last 12 months or so, and so she'll have a fresh idea on what the issues are. But for me, Craig's already covered some of the key things like records. The one he didn't really address, which I think is vital, is your financial records. You want to keep them up to date. Know how many hours you work, know how many chargeable hours. Set yourself a decent hourly rate and don't go below it. You're worth a lot. And if you want to understand how you're worth, there's some very good information on value pricing. Rather than $200 an hour or 300 or whatever, try and assess that information and set on a value basis. Now, I've been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years, not on all jobs, and it certainly meant my hourly rate, effective hourly rate, went up from about $240 an hour to about $360 an hour. So, $360 an hour, if you work 35 hours a week, and I'm not working that much now, gives you quite a comfortable income. So don't undersell yourself, is probably my message there. And the other big one, before I get Kelly to come up, is interact with other engineers. Get involved. Now, I belong to both the Waikato group of engineers, which I think I've probably belonged to that for nearly 25 years or so. They meet monthly for lunch for about an hour. And again, they do have a bit of an agenda, but just chatting with 6 or 7 other engineers, you'll be surprised. They have the same problems as you. And like sometimes I think I'm a real dumbass, but in actual fact, other engineers have the same concerns. So that's vital to me, is communicate with other people. If there's no group in your area, set one up. I was involved in the initial stages of the Rodney group as well when we shifted up there. So it's a great thing to do, and you get so much more back from it than what you contribute. And again, I think that if things go wrong, as Craig alluded to, work with your client to help fix it, be mindful of your insurance things, but keep talking to them. I've learnt the hard way, if you don't talk to them, little problems get to be big problems, and they get to be bigger problems. So keep that communication going and help your client fix it. You'll find, as I did, that I mucked up many years ago on a precast set of stairs. I accidentally or negligently only put half the reinforcing in them. This was for a commercial building. There were 3 sets of these stairs. So I admitted it. I went work with the client to fix it, talked to my insurers, and we ended up paying for the fix, which was about $18K way back then. But I've had that client now for the last 20 or 30 years, and I've probably had hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s worth of fees, and I'm currently working on a project for that client. So Kelly, if you're around, could you like to come up and add your bit?
Thank you, Gordon. Welcome, Kelly.
Okay, hi. I have never in my life stood in front of people and talked to them, so. And Gordon just approached me in the break to see if I had some words to part. So it's going to be pretty sort of off the cuff. As Gordon said, I've been in business for 12 months, just now receiving renewals for everything for business. All these things that I had no idea about 12 months ago when I decided to go out on my own. When I first left school, I thought I wanted to be an architect. So I went to architecture school, and the only paper I enjoyed was structures. So I thought, well, maybe it's just a Wellington thing and I'll finish my degree, and I did. I went and got a job for an engineer drafting, and promptly went off to engineering school and got another degree. I left there and I went on to Holmes and worked for Holmes, I think probably 12 years. And when I left Holmes, I thought to myself, now what am I going to do? They are the best of the best. They've got all of the top people there, all of the advice, everything, so much support. What am I going to do? This is, where do I go now? So one of my colleagues, Helen, he said to me, there's a group in Hamilton and we meet every month and just mostly sole practitioners. Come and join us and see what you think. And that's really been the key thing, I think, for me to keep my sanity, the support of other engineers. So that's my biggest, most important thing that I think you can take away from is just network with other engineers. As the little exercise before, everyone looks uncomfortably at the person next to them. We are all engineers. We don't, we like just dealing with our computer and not so much people, but that's, that's what it's about is the client focus. You've got to get to know your client. You've got to get to know what they want. And all the other things you really do learn along the way, the business advice, how to run a business, what to do, accounting, financial, marketing, all those things. You're one person, so you don't need a lot of, as long as you keep on top of it, you can always sort of catch up on things. But it's the engineering support, making sure you're doing it right, and delivering what your clients are looking for. Keep the communication open. I'm not sure on the time frame, but there we go.
I'd just like a really grateful thank you to Craig, Gordon and Kelly for standing up at very short notice. As Craig said, I was twisting his arm at 10:30 this morning to put a presentation together, so thank you very much. And a small plug for ACE New Zealand. Helen was supposed to be here this afternoon. I don't know how many of you know, my name's Martin, I work for Engineering New Zealand. Before I came to the dark side, I was working as an engineer in Lower Hutt, and I'm now the engineering practice manager for Engineering New Zealand. But I've been working with Helen, who used to be the legal manager at Engineering New Zealand, to start to work more with small practitioners. And so ACE is starting to look specifically at how they can be helping small practitioners, what tools and resources they can be putting in place as well. So we'll be reaching out through the EGP. And now I'd like to introduce Alisdair Sinclair. Alisdair used to work for DTCE Consulting and now works for Focus Engineering down in Wellington. He has been working inside New Zealand and mostly for a small practitioner for 20 odd years, and working for a large multinational in the UK for a number of years as well. He's been working as a checking engineer or on contract to Wellington City Council, and has come to talk about the differences in detailing for residential and light commercial practice. Over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks. I presume this is the advance button. Oh yeah, so 5-second history. I've worked for small places, but also some big places, and with the checking work, I've seen quite a lot of different types of work. So I just thought I'd quickly take a big look out. When you're in a commercial project, even a new warehouse or something in New Zealand, you've got a developer who has got to find money from somewhere for this. Then there's a project manager. They'll generally have a QS sitting underneath them. And then there's a bunch of different consultants, MEPs, architects, structures. Very often you'll get early contractor engagement so that people can optimize the design at a very early stage. And then fire engineer, facade engineer, and geotechnical engineer are normally a little bit shielded from all that, but they are involved in the background. And on bigger projects, you'll even have a temporary works engineer. So, there's a lot of different people that you have to communicate with all the time in commercial work. So there's a flurry of emails. When I was running mostly commercial projects, I spent 3/4 of my time emailing people and in meetings. And I think this is the real selling point for BIM. People always think of it as a modeling technology, but I think it's more powerful as thinking about it as a communication technology. And when you've got that many different people involved, it can be very tricky to divide up all of the responsibilities and make sure that everyone is doing their part, but sort of only their part. So I just produced this for a commercial building I did in the UK to explain to the myriad people just exactly what Pal Frishman was going to do compared to what everyone else. So, we've got piles by, as it happened, Pal Frishman, but geotech engineer versus someone else is going to do the detailing of all the connections versus someone else is going to do the facade connections, so on and so on and so on. This is supposed to be the other way around. The thing about commercial buildings is that they're often nice regular structures. So I did this drawing for Westman School, where I gave them about 10 different frame options at this very low level of detail so that they could kind of understand just kind of what the basic game we were going to be playing was. These are all accompanied by economy studies because economy is the main thing that commercial clients care about. They just want things to be as cheap as possible, and so you can't necessarily know what that is. But the point for this diagram is that basically it's a nice regular building, and whether I put my grids at 6 meters or 8 meters or whatever has a commercial implication, but other than that, no one really cares that much. So because you've got a kind of a design responsibility that's shared amongst a whole big group of people, quite often I found in commercial projects I'm producing kind of an intent drawing where you just sort of say, okay, I'm going to have a channel here, I'm going to have a UC here, whatever, and someone else is really going to sort out a lot of those details. For this one, which was pulled from a 20-story steel building in the UK, someone else was actually going to design the detailed sizes here. They're just indicative and all the connections. When you get into more smaller scale commercial stuff where in fact you are going to do the connection design, then you're doing full CAD, you're providing all the dimensions for everything, bolt sizes and so on and so forth. Okay, so then that's kind of the commercial world. When you get into domestic, it's sort of quite a different game because you've got a client, they're not reporting to anyone themselves. Probably no one is looking at the costs explicitly until a contractor writes an invoice, so there's a lot of murkiness there. A lot of the design is going to be done by some amorphous third-party entity that we have no real input on, so there's a building code acceptable solution for something somewhere that's going to be in your building, and then NZS 3604, which covers a lot of things, and you might agree or disagree with those things, but if you disagree, you have to kind of relitigate that. But the important thing is there's generally not that much of a supporting network for you. So if there's a fire engineer, pretty lucky, you'll have to worry about facade elements because there's wind and seismic and so on. Probably there's no geotech engineer, but there might be if you're lucky. And there's any temporary works are going to have to be designed by you. So you get these nice linear sort of single stage design projects where you have a client, they engage an architect, and then the information flows to a structural engineer. You do whatever black box engineering you want to do, perhaps do some calcs, I don't know, however you live your life. If you might feed that back to the architect and go through a second iteration of this, but for most domestic work. I don't think you probably do. It's just one and done. That gets sent off to the Building Consent Authority, and I could have drawn a second arrow pointing back to you again if they had any questions, which Stanley often does. So you could have a diagram like this, but again, probably no one ever really does. Just outlining who, and there's a lot of things here that effectively, that wall framing, if it fails, who's responsible? Well, 3604, the engineer's going to wear that probably one way or another, or there's going to be a conversation about whether they should. The structural engineer is doing the soil investigation most likely. They're thinking about the sequencing. They might design that composite beam, but the composite decking is probably to a proprietary span table. Again, if that misbehaves, who's going to take responsibility? And you're designing the retaining walls, and Michelle described herself as a specialist engineer, but I think you can see here that a specialist in this context really picks up quite a lot of different things. And then when you look at there's a picture missing here. I'm sure you can all imagine a building. So the picture in here was of a building I did in just a domestic house in Houghton Bay, which was on a bit of a hill. And because it stepped up the hill and the hill had a curve, it had 7 different structural levels. It had 3 wings, none of which were actually at right angles to another wing. It had projections, decks at different levels. There's no way that you can put this into ETABS even if you wanted to, because it's just too irregular. And so you're always kind of got your bit of paper and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm pushing with I always tell my grads, just imagine a giant has come and grabbed this part of the building. How does that load get into the ground? And with ETABS, you kind of feel like, oh, well, it doesn't matter where the giant is, but here you have to really think about every little spot. And then the details that you produce tend to be a lot of hand sketches, because clients don't want to pay necessarily for CAD if they don't have to. So you have to produce the tidiest thing you can for the least money you can, which is often going to be, I used a ruler for, no, I don't think I even used a ruler for this one. So, we're doing here some strengthening of a brick building, and everything is labelled on there, and I think they built this successfully, and hopefully it's standing up, I don't know, I haven't checked. But it's all hand drawings, it's all a little bit rougher. You're not necessarily having to dimension everything, and quite often for domestic scale projects, particularly alterations, you don't even know the dimensions. You couldn't label them if you wanted to. And then, this is also, they've come in at right angles, I'm not sure why. So anyway, hand sketches, it's a thing. And then you get involved, as I say, in construction sequencing. So this was a project where we weren't allowed to have any movement at the boundary at all. So we designed a temporary UC wall just for the short-term loads. And then the contractor was like, well, how the hell do I build it? And they're like, so, okay, yes, now here is exactly the steps that you have to go through. And I find myself doing this particularly for retaining wall construction all the time. And as a council checker, I found so often general practitioner engineers or structural engineers without a geotech holding their hand would design these wonderful walls that you couldn't ever possibly build. Let's see that 12-metre tall cut stand up for 3 weeks while you build the bottom of it. Yeah, good luck. Really good luck. And then, sequencing diagrams can occur even for really simple things. So we're taking out this corroded steel beam, putting in a couple of, I can't remember why we used RHSs, but we did. And, potentially having to really think through the detail of how this is going to happen in a way that, for commercial work, you would never bother to do it. The contractor who's going to do your big commercial job has their own in-house engineers who are going to solve all those problems for you, and really they don't want or need this input from you. So general practitioner again here picks up a lot more than just producing a design. And so that can often test the limits of your kind of ethical ability to operate as an engineer. So I was doing a house last year where without a registered architect, and they phoned me one day and there was just their drawing at this stage was a box floating near some ground. And they said, well, how do I waterproof it? I'm like, well, I don't know. But here are some structural forms I've seen that someone could think about how to waterproof. And so this diagram is really just covered with caveats saying, these are the options. Here's the thing you need to think about, you, the architect. And again, as a general practitioner engineer, this happens, all the time, where that something needs to happen. You probably don't know exactly what, and you're kind of ethically obliged to point out that it needs to happen, but also ethically obliged not to do it. So there's a lot of those kinds of minefields, which in the professionalism space is pretty interesting. And I imagine that a lot of this stuff generates complaints. People talk about unreasonable client expectations. Well, the client's expectation is that the engineer will tell them how to build the wall. This is part of telling them how to build the wall. So just wrapping up really quickly there. In commercial design, I've generally found that it's generally pretty collaborative. You're often involved at a really early scheming stage. I did a 5-story building in Wimbledon where they literally just had an idea of building a building. And so we went to 6 months of design team meetings. We were like, okay, it could be precast, it could be post-tensioned, it could be blah, 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 whatever. I produced about 30 schemes for them. But anyway, the point was we were there from day one. When that design went well, you're like, okay, well, no one messed it up. You often see in commercial structures, they want repeatability, so they want structural regularity. They want the same 6 portal frame sizes, roughly. They don't want like 10 different portal frames at different spacing. It's just a nice regular structure, so it lends itself well to analysis. It is often iterative because, particularly with value engineering, isn't all that we do valuable? I don't know. With value engineering, they want to change it from a 360 UB to a 250 PFC or whatever, who cares? But, there's a little bit of iterative. And you are in a nice, tightly confined, well-described box. Okay, for domestic, your engagement is normally late. The structural system is probably going to be a little bit fuzzy. Those multiple level of walls, who knows? The load gets down to the ground as long as some sort of capacity design says that the next bit in the chain is stronger. You're generally just getting one bite at it, and your responsibilities can be extremely wide, pretty much unlimited. Is the building going to be okay in one sense or another? So that's my summary of being an engineer. I have 4 minutes and 26 seconds for questions.
With that waterproofing detailing you're showing, if that ended up being a problem, what would happen with the legal point of view if you're giving advice on waterproofing?
Okay, so on this, probably can't read the text. It just says waterproofing detail. So the key thing that we're trying to convey here is that if you have one layer of waterproofing, that there's only a single point of failure in the system. And this is information for the architect so they can understand what the spatial needs are. Whereas, say that bottom left, if you've got a waterproofing membrane plus a cavity, then things are going to, even if the membrane fails, you're not going to have necessarily mold or whatever growing on timber, and you can kind of hope to fix it. And again, this covered with caveats. Waterproofing detail by others, typical drainage by others. Someone's got to control the water of this. The architect's got to think about how that water gets out the channel, all that kind of thing. But like I say, if they asked me and I just said nothing, and then they built the first one and the building leaks, I might not technically be liable, but really did I serve my client's interests there at all? Probably not. Because I think we all know that single system membranes, they fail. They are not reliable. Just one man's opinion. I think there was a question down there.
If you're dealing with a domestic project similar to the ones you've drawn sketches for, the drawings, and you've submitted that for building consent, how would you deal with that territorial authority who comes back and says, we won't accept those hand-drawn details, we want a proper drawing? Okay, so what the territorial authority wants to make sure of is that your building is safe and complies with the building code, roughly. And they're not normally necessarily going to be too bothered about how, as long as they are convinced that it does. So hand sketches should be totally acceptable, provided that they convey all of the information that a structural drawing needs to convey. I mean, I've never rejected a consent because someone drew hand drawings, and I've never had a question, someone saying, please draw this in CAD, because what we care about is the end product, which is the building, and everything that you do to get to a safe and reliable building is just... It is happening. That's bad, but I don't know. I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the waterproofing issue. You said, no, I'm not doing waterproofing, that's the liability of somebody else.
Sure.
And yet there might not be somebody else on these little projects. You're the only professional person there.
Yeah.
And, the other issue is that architects will do the top detail because it's the cheapest.
Yep.
And the builder will build the cheapest detail,
Yep.
which is the top one,
Yep.
not the bottom one. So where do you stand ethically on that as an engineering professional?
Your ethical responsibility is to provide the best advice you can. It's not your ethical responsibility to force someone to take it.
This keeps coming up again and again. Engineers are sort of washing their hands of waterproofing and waterproofing details. But we've seen, and I'm seeing it again and again, architects do not know how to keep water out of a building.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it? No, that's the issue. Isn't it their problem? Yeah, whose problem is it? This is it. You know that detail won't work. You know it's going to leak. But they'll come back and say, well, that's what we've been doing for 20 years.
Yeah. No, it's tough.
No, that top detail will work if it's the right product and it's applied correctly.
All right. I see that the counter has started down to the next person's time. So
It is. Thank you, Alisdair. I appreciate your time. And next, I think we're handing over the stage. We have Things I Wish I Knew, Starting a Small Business, with Julie Elliott, Hawk Cooper, and Anthony Cook.
Yeah, the things I wish I knew. Hi, I'm Julie Elliott, a chartered structural engineer from the EGP committee member. I want to go out on my own, but I have all these questions about how to do it. I don't know where to start. Oh, I know. Let's ask some peers from the EGP network to get their input about how they started up their own business. These are only their stories and views expressed and are being shared to help you start a thought process. You should not rely upon this information for making any business or any other decisions. Always complete your own research and find advice from your own experts. Let me introduce to you Anthony Cook from ARC Civil and Hawk Cooper from 10 Degrees Design. So, why did you decide to start your own business, Hawk?
Basically, it was situational for me, so that was a primary factor. And then I wanted the flexibility that working for myself offered. So, situational flexibility.
Thank you. And for me, it was a desire to work when I want and where I want, and in theory, less hours than a normal full-time job.
So not like that?
Yeah, so I found out the boss is the one with the money, yeah.
What were your startup costs?
Well, assuming you have your own computer calculator, email, it's basically $4,500 for me, which was the structural insurance. If you want to add things like Bluebeam, AutoCAD, it's another $1,400. But overall, the yearly operational costs for me are approximately $18,000, and that includes the rental of a desk space.
Yeah, so similarly, there's not much startup costs, I think. There's about maybe 3,000 or 4,000. Buy yourself a printer and that. For me, the subscriptions are the problem, so the operational costs are probably around 30,000 a year.
So you've got to put a little bit aside for the whole year.
Yeah.
And do your clients pay on time?
Mostly. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a little bit out. How many hours do you actually work?
So normally it's about 40 to 45 hours per week. But I frequently find myself working weekends, so just watch out for that. As regards switching off, that's a little bit harder when you work for yourself. I kind of use my business as an avatar that says no to people rather than me saying no to people. So my business says I finish at 6 p.m.
For me, about 2 months ago, I said, I'll do a busy week, and that was about 60 or 70 hours, and it's been about that for 3 months. But productivity, maybe around 70%. The two best things I have for switching off is if you're going for family time or a meeting, just turn your phone off, and at the end of the day, have a to-do list. so you don't have to think about it the next day or overnight.
Nice. Do you have time for holidays?
Not yet. No.
Not yet. How do you price jobs?
So for me, I work for myself, but I work closely with another engineer in Wellington. So he's kind of like my mentor. So occasionally I'll run jobs past him if I'm needing to price new projects. And then with time, obviously, comes experience, and you know what wins projects and what loses projects. So experience and mentors really helps, being connected to other engineers.
Yeah, I think trial and error is the best advice. You start off thinking it's going to take this many hours at this charge out rate, but you may or may not get the job, and you just have to learn from experience.
Okay. Great. How does your quality assurance system work? Or do you have one?
Well, I used to work for an ISO 9001 company, so they had procedures for everything: emails, drawings, calculations. So I've taken that into my business, and I use a lot of the ENZ forms and tools, and I've automated all those QA documents and put them in a project. So when I start a new project, it's pre-populated with all those files: design features report, PS1's schedule of inspections, certificate of design, that kind of stuff. And then for me, because I'm on my own, all my projects are externally peer-reviewed by a chartered professional engineer from another company.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, so if you guys didn't know, under the members area, all those forms are under your members under resources, so you can find them following that link. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so for QA, it is hard to have your own sort of robust system when you're by yourself. So Julie gave me some good advice, which is to, not send things out at the end of the day. Wait for, the morning when you've got a fresh set of eyes. But I do get advice when I need to on critical things.
Those were our quick 5 questions. Now we have time for a panel of helpers. But just before we do that, I have a little thank you here for Hawk and Anthony, because I managed to coerce them. They're not part of the committee, and it actually takes a bit of time to put a presentation together, as we've realised. So give this one to you, Hawk. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you. Cheers.
We need more people that just put their hand up and say, yes, I'll do it. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks very much.
Now, if Gordon's kind of already done it, but if Gordon would also come back around, so and if you can start thinking about your questions. And I've got one to start with. So we've got Gordon, Ian, who's grabbing a chair, and Pete, with a vast amount of experience amongst them, as well as Anthony and Hawk here to answer your questions. And the one we're going to start with is, what is the biggest hurdle you've overcome? And I think, Pete, you had an answer to that you wanted to use, so if you just grab that.
Right. Yeah. For me, the most important thing was to get rid of all of the things that take up time that aren't engineering.
Just hold it up.
Yep. Okay, got it. So, very, very early on when I went out on my own, I found a woman who was able to take care of all the money side of everything. Not only does she do that, she does all the administration, and it means that I can focus entirely on doing engineering, and it means my accounts go out, it means all my taxes are sorted out, I have no worries at all in that department. So for me, that was the best investment I've ever made. And she's part-time, but I have another off-sider, but we pay for her 10 times over, so that would be my best advice, is get somebody to sort your money out.
For me, the advice is marry the right woman.
That's a hard act to follow. Yeah, I've been married for quite a long time too, so it's actually worked out.
For me, I think that when you go on as a sole practitioner or small practice, you really need your support around you from other engineers, basically. And so the group that's formed, which Gordon here formed up in Rodney, it's been great because you just go along and share, and for a sole practitioner, that's amazing.
Now,
I'll just correct that. Julie's late husband was probably the prime mover. We were both, Duncan and I were both in Coast Guard together doing rescue stuff, and we got talking, and basically that's how it happened.
So does the audience have any other questions? There's a mic work right here, if anyone's got any pressing.
I just wanted to ask the audience, how many of you know about and have joined EGP already? Can we just have a show of hands? Yep. So for the rest of you, do you actually know what it's about? And perhaps you have some questions along that line of why we're here and what's our goals, if you like.
While you're thinking about that, I'll just describe an event that happened a long time ago for me. I got a summons. I was sued. It was a job in Hamilton involving piling. The client refused to pay for a geotech report, so I thought, that'll be okay. We'll just check it out when they do the boring. But the client refused to engage me to do that. The piles were constructed, and probably 8 years later, we get the summons saying things are wrong. But in that, despite what my insurer said, they thought we had a good claim in that the design, that I hadn't been engaged to do the geotech or construction observation. So it went to court, which is a painful process, very lengthy, and emotionally quite draining, and even more draining was when the court found against me. Found against me on the basis that they said the design wasn't complete until the construction was complete. And for me that was another very powerful lesson, and I've never done a PS4 or any design job without construction monitoring since. And I think Craig alluded to that about the PS4s. Be very careful in that situation. For me, I won't issue a PS4, I won't take a job on unless we're doing construction monitoring.
Anybody have any thoughts?
We can move on.
Yes.
My understanding is that for liability, you're liable for a certain number for years, is that correct? And my understanding is that liability extends from when you sign your PS4. What if you design the job?
Craig could probably answer that better than me, but
You don't actually get engaged, you might lose the job, you don't get engaged to continue it through, and you never know whether someone's actually gone ahead with it or not.
well, yeah, for me, I'm at that stage of my career, if people don't do it my way, I don't get involved. But I understand for new practitioners, I certainly, when I started off, I did everything that I thought I could do, and I probably did a few I shouldn't have done, just to sort of keep the money coming in, because no one's mentioned it, but the cash flow when you first start up is a big deal, because you mightn't get paid for 2 or 3 months, depending on the size of the job. In the meantime, you've got all your normal expenses to go through. How do you guys find that?
At the moment, I haven't had any issues, but
just another question.
See how it could be an issue.
Gordon, you say always follow through with the PS4. What if you get an NZS 3604 house and you just got to design one beam for it? Can't the council look after that one?
That's probably the only exception, but I'm very wary about that because I've been involved where something goes wrong with that beam. So it has to be something really minor and a contractor I would work with and trust before I'd even let that one go.
Thank you.
Should we answer the question about this?
I guess, yeah, a little bit of clarification. Took me a while to work out what the actually asking. So maybe a situation where you've actually done most of the construction monitoring, say for a house, and you're expecting the builder to give you their final PS3, a few other things, so that you can sign it off. But say they never come back to you, so you've technically done the construction monitoring, you're pretty confident, but you don't sign it PS4. So does your liability continue?
Yeah, look, Craig might have a different answer to me on this, but what I do is I put on a note on the PS4 to say that work was substantially completed on a certain date, and that's usually, might be a year or two earlier. And I'm hoping that that would stand up to say that that's the starting point for your period of liability. Craig, you might want to cover that.
This does come up quite regularly. I think we're all asked for PS4s years and years after the fact if it's just dropped off the radar or a project's taken a long time to complete. I think in those instances you shouldn't issue a PS4. You should issue a letter stating what inspections, maybe append your site reports from the time, really just as a summary of what work you completed up to that point in time. And that your last attendance on a project will be when the 6 years, or maybe if it's a claim in tort, the 10-year long stop would arrive from. Don't get bullied into issuing PS4s years down the track. No, you can't. This comes up regularly. I think some firms will issue will fill out a PS4 when the job's complete and leave it in the file and hand it over, when requested. That's okay, but I think it's bordering on fraudulent to backdate anything, including a PS4. I think you're better off just closing it out with a letter and a summary of what work you did at that time, and that's when your liability will start from.
Has that ever been accepted by councils, though? You might be bullied by them, essentially.
No, and yeah, you should resist that as well. I think with the right attitude and explanation, I know Christchurch City Council in Queenstown and Auckland, I think it's cropped up in Auckland, will accept that. They realise that we've had jobs where 10 years down the track someone says, we never got, especially for private homeowners, who they don't think about closing out and getting code compliance until they go to sell their house. And it's like, oh shit, we need all this. Just don't do it.
There's some determinations on that, where they've issued building consent without PS4 all the time.
Yep.
Is there an obligation for the engineer to inform the clients of doing that PS4?
Yeah, I think it's just good housekeeping, and perhaps, despite me telling everyone to do all this sort of stuff, we're far from squeaky clean as well. But a couple of years ago we triggered it that our accounts process now triggers the PS4, to send out the final invoice and trigger a PS4 and just do it, just as a reminder to get whoever the engineer was to ring up the builder. Is this complete? Can I have your PS3s? Just tidy up those loose ends, close your file, move on. Yeah.
I've been in that situation where you provided a letter rather than a PS4 stating facts, if you like, construction observations, because I've said, listen, I'm not willing to offer a PS4 in that case.
Is there actually any real difference in terms of legal liability, though?
No. So there's nothing. It's another example of there's nothing magical about the producer statement suites. It's just a form that's a means of compliance that's accepted by TAs and BCAs. A letter can say exactly the same thing. All you're conveying to the recipient of that producer statement is the work that was done to give them a means for issuing the co-compliance in the state of a PS4, same as a PS1, is a means of demonstrating competence to issue a building consent. So That's why if you have that discussion with the TAs, 9 times out of 10, you'll hopefully get a reasonable person. If it's a year or so down the track, issue a PS4. I think your insurers would back you up, but just don't get drawn into it years and years down the track, because that will restart your liability clock.